Welcome to Between the Lines. In today's video, we're going to do a line-by-line analysis of the poem Nothing by William Wordsworth. So let's just jump right into it. It seems a day, I speak of one from many singled out, one of those heavenly days that cannot die, when, in the eagerness of boyish hope, I left our cottage threshold, sallying forth. One of the first things that we would notice when we start reading the poem is that the first line is indented. Notice the huge gap here between where we would expect the line to start and where it actually starts. Now, my favorite interpretation of this gap or indentation is to think of the poem as starting from silence. So the poem starts from a sort of peacefulness. It starts peacefully. Whereas if you look at the final few lines of the poem, and we'll get to that part later, the poem also ends on a peaceful note. But in the middle, you have the rising action of the poem, and there is a sort of conflict that goes on in the middle, and it is resolved by the end of the poem, and the poem ends peacefully. So what is the poet trying to tell us? The poet is recollecting one of the days of his early childhood, and he's narrating to us the incidents that happened on that day. Notice the use of words like heavenly, eager, and hope. These are very positive words, and they convey the meaning they convey the idea that Wordsworth is looking back on his childhood very fondly. He has positive, very fond, bright memories of his childhood. That is what is conveyed in the first few lines. He says, when in the eagerness of boyish hope, he left his cottage threshold, sallying forth. Right? He's going to continue this chain of thoughts as we progress through the poem. But let's look at a few other words here. The word threshold refers to anything that distinguishes one thing from another. Here it just refers to the door of the cottage. If you look at a window, it has a window sill, right? Similarly, if you look at a door, the part where it meets the floor is called the threshold, right? Forgive my poor handwriting, but I just wrote down threshold, right? And it separates the cottage itself from the outside world. So it's a cottage threshold. And the word sallying has two different meanings. Normally, it just means to set out to do something, to go out on a mission. It's sallying, right? But interestingly, it also has a second meaning, which has a militaristic sort of connotation. Specifically, if you are being attacked by the enemy, your garrison is being attacked by the enemy, and you decide to go on an offensive to attack the enemy, like you are on the offensive now, that is called sallying, right? So this has a sort of military connotation. Right. So this is important. So far we've learned that the poet Wordsworth is recollecting the events that happened on a specific day in his childhood. And we also come to know that he has very fond memories of his childhood, and he's talking to us about a particular day on which he left his cottage, the comforts of his cottage, right? And he's going out into the unknown. Let's move on. I left our cottage threshold, sallying forth, with a huge wallet over my shoulders slung, a nutting crook in hand, and turned my steps toward some far distant wood, a figure quaint, tricked out in proud disguise of cast-off weeds, which for that service had been husbanded by exhortation of my frugal dame. There is a lot to unpack here, and I know that if you're reading this for the first time, or if you're listening to this for the first time, it's not very easy to understand, right? But that's why we're here. That's why I'm here, and I'm going to help you understand all of this. Before we get into what all of this means, Let's look at some of the poetic techniques that have been used here. The first one, and one that's very obvious, is the use of elision, right? And that is simply, so that is simply the omission of a syllable, right? So instead of saying over, Wordsworth says o'er, and that is called elision. And in the phrase shoulders slung, we have alliteration, or the repetition of a consonant sound. So the poet is saying he had a huge wallet or a bag, and he had it over his shoulders. It was slung over his shoulders, right? And in his hand, he had a nutting crook. A nutting crook is sort of like a long rod with a sort of crooked end, right? And you use it to pull branches close to you so that you can get the fruit, right? So that's a nutting crook. And he has it in his hand, and he in his other hand he has his wallet, or like a large bag, and he's going out. You can imagine Wordsworth stepping out of the cottage, crossing the cottage threshold, stepping out, and he has all of this, and he's slowly walking deep into the woods, right? So he says, and turned my steps toward some far distant wood, a figure quaint, tricked out in proud disguise of cast-off weeds. So he's now starting to describe what he looked like, what was his attire. So he says he looked like a quaint figure. So quaint means sort of strange. Something that's quaint is something that's odd, or something that stands out, right? So he is referring to himself as a quaint figure. And he was tricked out in proud disguise of cast-off weeds, which means he was wearing sort of shabby clothing, right? Which for that service had been husbanded by exhortation of my frugal dame. And the clothes that he was wearing were carefully chosen for him by his mother. This reference to frugal dame, actually, he's talking about his mother, right? So his mother has chosen for him an outfit that she wants him to wear as he goes out into the forest, right? And the word husbanded just means when someone takes care of something, that's called husbandry, right? Animal husbandry. So husbanding is just taking care of something, being very I should say focused on something, putting all your energy towards something to take care of it. That's husbanding. So he says his mother was very careful, and she chose this outfit for him. And exhortation, for those who are not aware, just means persuasion, like persuading someone to do something. Persuasion. Good. So Wordsworth has talked about, first off, he starts talking about those heavenly days of his childhood, and he narrates to us this incident of, how he left his cottage and what he was wearing, and so on and so forth. Let's move on, and the poem will start to get interesting as we move along. So I hope you'll stick around and watch the entire video, right? All right. So by exhortation of my frugal dame, motley accoutrement of power to smile at thorns and brakes and brambles, and in truth more ragged than need was, o'er pathless rocks, through beds of matted fern and tangled thickets, forcing my way, I came to one dear nook. Let's unpack this. What does motley mean? Motley is something that's random, something that does not have any rhyme or reason to it, right? So random. And accoutrement it refers to the things that one has on his or her body, except for clothing. So if this also actually has a militaristic connotation, like it refers to the things that the things that a soldier carries, which are not his clothing. So maybe like the magazines, the ammunition, perhaps, a soldier would carry like a, what do you call it? A shield? It's not a shield. I can't think of the right word for it. Like a vest, right? A bulletproof vest. So all of these additional things that a soldier has is the soldier's accoutrement, right? So he's once again just talking about his clothing, or I should rather say the accessories that one has other than sort of the clothing itself. So he's talking about how he was wearing these shabby clothes and he has a nutting crook and a bag, and it all sort of looks quaint, right? It all sort of looks strange. Like, where is this boy going? Like, what is he wearing? So, motley accoutrement of power to smile at thorns and brakes and brambles. I've tried to think of what this could mean, and I've thought deeply. And my best interpretation of this part is that despite his shabby clothing, despite the poor financial background that he may have come from, he has a very optimistic outlook, right? When he sees the world, he has the ability to smile at thorns, at brakes and brambles. I think that's what Wordsworth is trying to convey here. And in this context, the word brakes refers to thickets, right? Thickets. What are thickets? Thickets are dense sections of the forest. They could be like a dense set of trees, or or a dense set of shrubs, like little plants, but they have to be really dense. That's what it means, thickets. So brakes is a synonym for thickets, and brambles refers to like blackberry shrubs, or it could just refer to the fruit, like the blackberries themselves, right? Blackberries. So Wordsworth has, I should rather say, as a boy, he had the ability to smile at thorns and brakes and brambles despite his shabby clothing, despite his financial background. And once again, he starts talking about his clothing. It seems like he can't get over the sort of clothes that he was wearing. And he says, in truth, more ragged than need was. The clothes that he was wearing were more ragged, were more shabby than, excuse me, we have like a cock that keeps on crowing. Anyway, so he says, in truth, so it says, in truth, his clothing was more ragged than it needed to be, right? Okay, so that was all about, his own description, what he looked like, what he was wearing, what he was carrying, so on and so forth. Now he's starting to tell us what the journey was like, what it was like to actually travel through these dense woods. So he says he journeyed over pathless rocks, through beds of matted fern and tangled thickets, right? Oops, sorry. So here the word pathless signifies that no human being had traveled through the woods. Like, Wordsworth is the first person to traverse these sections of the woods. That's what the word pathless means, right? There's no path there, which means not a lot of human beings have been through these sections of the forest. Through beds of matted fern. Fern, once again, refers to a sort of tree, perhaps like a Christmas tree, right? It's a fern. So he's going through pathless rocks, beds of matted fern, and tangled thickets. I've already talked about what thickets means, right? So he's going through dense sections of the forest. He's crossing huge rocks. He's going through these sections of fern trees, and he's forcing his way. Forcing is a rather violent way to put it, right? The word force obviously has it connotes violence. It has a violent connotation. So keep this in the back of your mind. We have come across a few of these words, and I'll talk about the idea of violence against nature in a separate video. I'll do a separate video focusing on sort of eco-criticism, looking at this piece from the perspective of eco-criticism, and there we'll talk about these sorts of connotations of violence throughout the poem. But just keep this in the back of your mind. So it says, forcing my way, I came to one dear nook. So at last, after traversing huge rocks and all of these thickets and dense forest and all of that, he finally comes to one deer nook, one section of the forest which he describes as deer, right? So one clearing in the forest, he finally comes there. So let's move on. Forcing my way, I came to one deer nook, unvisited, where not a broken bough drooped with its withered leaves, ungracious sign of devastation, but the hazels rose tall and erect, with tempting clusters hung. So this clearing, this little nook of the forest which Wordsworth has finally come to, he says it was unvisited, which means no human was there before him, at least as far as he could tell. So this section of the forest is pristine. It has not been seen by human eyes. It has not been touched by human hands. And Wordsworth is there in the flesh, right? And he goes on to describe it and he says, where not a broken bough drooped with its withered leaves. The word bough just means branch, like the branch of a tree. So there was not a single broken branch that drooped with withered leaves, right? So withered leaves are obviously leaves that have shed or that are almost going to shed, right? And he goes on to talk about, he says the withered leaves are an ungracious sign of devastation. But the section of the forest in which Wordsworth now finds himself, that section of the forest does not have any withered leaves. That is, it is full of life. There is not even a single withered leaf there. At least that's sort of the idea that we get from reading the poem, right? So he's in this pristine section of the forest which has not been seen by humans before, which has not been experienced by humans before, and Wordsworth is there in the flesh. So then he finally comes to the point, like, but the hazels rose tall and erect, with tempting clusters hung. So he finally sees these huge hazelnut trees, right? Hazels. And those were tall trees and they were erect, which just means they were upright, right? And they had tempting clusters of hazelnuts, obviously. And this idea of temptation, once again, just keep this in the back of your mind. We'll do a separate analysis of all this. This will be a separate interesting video. But yeah, we've come this far in the poem. I will make a separate part 2 because I don't want a single video to be extremely long and boring. I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope you learned a little bit, and I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.